Chapter 18, Part 2, Post-Impressionism. So Post-Impressionism is a movement based on the Impressionism that came about a generation before. It is more theoretical, it is more experimental, and it is more individual as far as the styles of the artists go. The Impressionists were interested in light and the way that light creates color, and really in the study and investigation of light in a painting form. Post-Impressionists concentrated on color and brushstroke, kind of the two main visual aspects of late Impressionism, and they took those ideas and ran with them. So there are a handful of post-Impressionist artists that I want to talk about today. First being Paul Cézanne, and he's probably the most influential of the post-Impressionists. Cézanne, in this image, has a modern Olympia. You can see the squiggles of paint, the loose brushwork, and of course the reference to Edouard Manet's Olympia, which had been a scandalous painting about 10 years earlier in 1864, 1863. Here you have the servant, the maid, kind of revealing the body. There is a small dog instead of a black cat. And this is a self-portrait of Cézanne looking at this painting. So he is, of course, accustomed to looking at other paintings, looking at other art, engaging with what will come to be art history, what is for him current events in painting. And the style of this is loose, it is impressionistic, in a word, and that is, kind of a response to earlier painting. And of course, Manet is not an impressionist, but they try to claim him. He really lays the foundation for a painting that emphasizes paint on canvas first and is not illusionistic. So Cézanne is so influential because he has a theory that an object can be broken into planes of color. This is very much related to color value. All color has a value or an amount of light or dark that is there. Purple tends to have the most value, or is the deepest, and yellow tends to be the brightest. So if you want to have a composition that doesn't use shadows of gray, you can use purple sections, yellow sections, everything else is somewhere in between to make things appear to be in the shadows or in the highlights, that sort of thing. He has this theory, and he begins to work, like the Impressionists do, with subject matter that doesn't mind if you paint it in a weird way, such as apples on a table. The still life is considered the lowest of the low as far as subject matter goes from the old academic standpoint, which says that history painting and mythology and religion is king and everything else is further down the ladder, with landscape being just above still life. The Impressionists loved to paint landscape. That's where the light was. Cézanne paints still lifes because he's not so interested in light but in color. And this is his still life with apples from 1890. The apple that seems to be closest to us, keeping in mind that it's entirely a flat painting, is this one on the bottom. And the edge that seems to be the closest to us is painted with yellow. He cools off the yellow, adding a little bit of blue, which makes green. He adds a little bit of red to make orange, which is here. The leading edge of the plate, the one that seems to be closest to us, has a yellow highlight here, and then a little bit of blue here, which makes this seem to go further back. So by foregoing tans and browns as shadows and emphasizing instead the value of a variety of colors, he can construct a painting using chunks or planes of color that still seems to be three-dimensional. And of course he puts a little bit of blue here, a little bit of green, loose brush strokes in the background to push that background further back. And this is kind of a bluish tint here that seems to set this section of the canvas further back in space. So the subject matter that he chooses is simply because this is considered unimportant. It's good to have a jumping off point that does not matter as far as the way that you paint it, right? The apples are not going to get upset if they're painted in a weird way, such as someone might get upset if you painted a weird crucifixion. Similarly, he paints a mountain near his house again and again and again and again and again, just like Claude Monet paints the cathedral near his house. And, excuse me, Mount Saint Victoire is the mountain. He paints it from different points of view. Sometimes it seems to be fairly solid, emphasizing particular trees, emphasizing the landscape. He has the relatively cool blues and purples up near the top towards the background, the relatively warmer kind of reddish browns, and then greens as the middle ground here. Sometimes it seems to almost dissolve into little chunks and planes of color. Sometimes it seems very solid, sometimes it seems very loose. Always it is first and foremost paint on canvas. And in this image you can see from this series of paintings the variations that he gives on this same landscape. So his control, like a scientist with an experiment, is the mountain itself. What he changes is the way that he paints the mountain and the color relationships, and he almost deconstructs it in a way. The images on the bottom here seem to be very fragmented, disjointed, just little squares or cubes of color that still denote landscape. If you were familiar with this place, you would probably recognize it. And there's also a collapse of space that shows up in his paintings of landscapes. As it seems to dissolve, it becomes increasingly flat. The foreground doesn't seem to come forward that much more than the background. And that is on purpose as he experiments with that. There is, again, the use of simultaneous views as a departure from traditional painting. So this looks like a regular still life, but if you follow this line visually, it disappears behind the cloth, and then either it drops down or it jumps up, but it's not in the same place. And is this the edge of the table, or is this the edge of the table with a shadow? And it's kind of hard to tell. Same thing in the back. This line goes along through here, and then it drops down, and this is a book or a block propping up the apples, and this is lower than this. So Cezanne writes that he has discovered by moving around, he can get multiple points of view. So if I'm going to paint a picture of one of you guys, I might put tape on the floor so I know where to stand. And if I move, it's the same as you moving. If you close one eye, and then the other, and then the other, and then the other, back and forth, things shift ever so slightly because of the distance between your two eyes, right? And you have those two differing points of view when you isolate them. Of course, two eyes together gives you stereo vision. So he writes that he has discovered by leaning a little to the left, leaning a little to the right, standing on tiptoe, he can get multiple perspectives, multiple points of view within the same painting. He is aware that the painting is absolutely flat, but real life is three-dimensional. One thing that a camera can do is accurately describe from a single eyeball, a single lens, what is before it. The thing it cannot do is to show life in three dimensions in the 1860s, 1870s. So this is pushing painting past just doing what a camera can do into an exploration of color, into an exploration of perspective and viewpoint. The bottle of wine, pretty much straight on, but you can see the top just a little bit. These top two pastries seem like they are leaning up. The basket of apples is spilling out. It's also leaned up. The table edge jumps up and down, front and back. So it looks at first glance like a traditional still life, but he is taking apart the expectations of the way a painting can work and trying to incorporate the three-dimensionality of life within his painting of a simple still life. So there is a retrospective career show of Cezanne's work from his early days up through his late experiments in 1905, 1906. All the artists in Paris go to see it. And both Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse are quoted as saying Cezanne is the father of us all, meaning modern painters, because they're able to see his experiments laid out in a row chronologically. They're able to see multiple still lifes with fruit on a table, multiple paintings of the same mountain again and again and again and again and again until it seems to come apart, deconstruct, and go back together. They see within his painting a collapse of space, a use of multiple points of view at the same time, and an increasing flatness and emphasis on the picture plane, that flat surface of the canvas itself on which an illusion is usually created, rather than an emphasis on depth and the illusion that the painting goes back through the wall in Renaissance perspective. So the abstractions, the flatness, the emphasis on the planar aspects of color and how it tends to come forward or go back in space are the seeds and kernels of modern painting. So Picasso, excuse me, and Matisse, both really innovative modern painters, look to Cezanne as the beginning point for painting in the way that they understand it. And Georges Seurat is also influential in his approach to color. He uses theories about optical color mixing and complementary color. Complementary colors are opposites on a color wheel. So red and green are complements, or violet and yellow are complements. And of course, uh, violet or purple and yellow are opposites on the color wheel, as well as opposites in terms of value, right? One is very dark, the other is very light. When you mix two complementary colors together, such as red and green or purple and yellow, you get effectively a gray. So they cancel each other out in a sense. Uh, this is an example of his pointillism, and it works for us today kind of like pixels on a computer screen, which is something we're very familiar with. Of course, in the 1800s, they were not. So the water here has a lot of blue dots, a lot of yellow dots added, which makes kind of a greenish area. And he puts more darker dots here, which makes a sense of shadow, and he puts lighter dots here, which makes a sense of light. The brown that is here is a reddish brown that is made of a bunch of different colors of dots. So if you have, I used to have red hair, right? My beard is mostly gray now. But when it was mostly red, there was some red, there was some brown, there was some black, there was a little bit of gray. There were a variety of colors. They're often there with light or medium tint hair. Uh, from a distance, they blend together to give the same tone. So you're aware that if you dye your hair, it dyes it all the same color, right? If it's an effective, complete uh, dyeing of hair. Natural hair that is of, say, a medium tone, not super, super dark or super, super light, will often have kind of a mixture of individual strands, and together they blend in to form one solid color from a distance. This painting works along those same lines. So pointillism, or tiny little dots or points of color, draws from the tiny dots used by the Impressionists, and it pushes it further. So this is Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. This painting is about 10 feet across. It is made entirely of tiny dots of color. You can see that the green of the trees begins to dissolve into the blue of the background because he just puts less green dots here and they blend into the blue. Things appear to be fairly solid. He has some outlines, but he fills them in with little dots. You can see that the shadows have a lot of purple, a lot of dark green, and this is incredibly time consuming. This is the way that pixels on a computer or TV screen work today. When I was a kid and we had tube televisions, if you got so close so as to ruin your eyes or to be the remote control when I was a little kid, then you would see tiny little squares with slivers of red, blue, and green within them. The same as the three plugs on the back of an Xbox if you don't use an HDMI cable today. So those red, green, and blue are the three primaries for light. And when you put them all together, you get the right amount of each of those to make the cartoon or the newscaster's face or whatever you were watching on television at the time. Same sort of thing works here. A bunch of tiny dots work together to give the color that you see from a distance a sense of being solid. And that is his most significant painting. It is in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago Museum, and it is very large. Took a very long time to make it. He also advocates that painters be paid by the hour, like laborers, because it takes him so long to paint these. And the content of this is, of course, the dots, right? The painting is about the way that it's painted, but it also shows people from all walks of life, all social strata joined together on this island. It's a little bit of a social commentary as well as just an experiment in form. And this is his circus sideshow to show you a pretty good example of his technique up close. So you have someone playing a trombone, looks to be the ringmaster here, and everything has a grainy quality that comes from all the dots. Let me zoom in on a detail, and you can see it side by side. Here is that painting. Here is that guy. Here is that guy up close. And you can tell that these are taken from this section. There are greens and reds and oranges and yellows and blues and purples all jammed together to form this kind of uniform greenish pattern that is here. So it's thoroughly experimental. It takes the ideas of the Impressionist and it creates something absolutely new. And this is still a technique that we teach in color theory as a standard today. It's a good way to understand this particular approach to color, and that is Seurat's pointillism. Toulouse-Lautrec is another well-known post-impressionist, and he tends to paint scenes of nightlife. One current throughout Impressionism and Post-Impressionism is that they don't seem to paint anything really important as far as subject matter goes, right? They're not tackling history, they're not tackling mythology or religion, but they show people that they know, lunching on a boating party or people gathering at a cafe. Toulouse-Lautrec painted scenes of nightlife, which were a fairly new thing in Paris at the time. So the scenes from his world are populated with dancers and drinkers and prostitutes. This is at the Moulin Rouge, and here's a better version of that. And he has crossed over into abstraction in places. So the people are recognizable, but there is deliberate exaggeration in terms of color and lighting. There are gas lights that allow people to stay up at night in the clubs, and this lady did not leave the house looking like this with a turquoise forehead and white bottom half of her face. But that is Toulouse-Lautrec's interpretation of her face lit by the gaslights. Bright red lipstick, powdered face, bluish shadows here, bright yellow hair. And of course, she comes out in the foreground as a focal point. Notice that this paint is fairly thick, covers the canvas well. The painting of the garments is often kind of thin and filmy. There is thick paint here, thin paint here, as a pretty consistent aspect of Toulouse-Lautrec's painting. There is a red diagonal here coming up in the lower bottom left, which kind of draws your eye back. And then, of course, a diagonal that goes this way that leads you to these people who are the main focal point. This lady as well has seen under the gaslights, almost garish makeup. This guy has a red ear and a yellow beard. So he is pushing past visual color. He is exaggerating for the sake of the painting. And this is a self-portrait that is Toulouse-Lautrec included in the background there. So Toulouse-Lautrec pushes color towards the experimental, towards the expressive, and his point of view, painting in nightclubs and dance halls and brothels as he does. He actually gets his mail in a brothel at one point and lives there. Shows you the underside of Parisian life and of the nightlife. And then Vincent van Gogh. So Van Gogh is the household name of expressive painters. Within his lifetime, he was not well known. He was hugely unsuccessful as an artist, as far as anyone could tell. Although we could not scrape up enough money between the lot of us to buy a Van Gogh painting, of course, today. They're all in the millions of dollars. So Van Gogh worked with brushstroke, which everyone knows about his work, and expressive color. He is also largely self taught. In his early paintings, like the Potato Eaters here from 1885, there is a loose sense of drawing and anatomy. This guy should have more of a back of the head. His sense of anatomy is not quite where it should be with some of his early paintings, and there are others besides this that have the same characteristics. It's also very dark, which shows the darkened conditions that these very poor people lived in. They had potatoes and potatoes only for dinner. But there is the same brushstroke, the same kind of clunkiness that is there as part of Van Gogh's painting. He's his own guy as far as painting styles go. His brother is a gallery owner, so his brother sells paintings for a living and supports Vincent van Gogh financially. But no one really wants to buy Vincent's paintings. They look really, really weird. He sells one painting in his lifetime. This is a portrait of a friend of his, and you can see his characteristic brushstrokes just kind of building up a surface of the painting itself. Also, in the background, you can see these really brightly colored Japanese prints, and that is a huge key to the look of Vincent van Gogh's artwork. The artwork of Japan that was becoming available in Europe at the time was cheap prints that were brightly colored with bold outlines. They did not use light and shadow. They used color and painted outline. They were woodcuts. And they were not considered fine art in Japan. They were considered the art of the people, popular art, not really in keeping with the very old Japanese tradition that was revered in Japan. These sort of Japanese prints, which are now very well thought of worldwide, were only first collected and published in book form in Paris after they make their way to Europe. So these prints that are in the background are the key to why Van Gogh's color schemes look the way that they do. Bright colors, excuse me, bold outlines. This is his night cafe, and it's a great example of expressive color use. Ordinarily, a pool table would be smooth or it would not function. This one is very, very rough in texture. This guy has green hair, green mustache, green eyebrows because the light comes from this gas lamp with sort of a greenish and yellow-orange glow. You can see the thick brushstrokes of the painting itself here. See the texture that is such a part of Van Gogh's paintings. His highlights on the purple bottle are a bit of yellow and a bit of white blended together while the paint is still wet. And like the Impressionists, Van Gogh is painting wet into wet. He paints quickly. He does not put down layers and glaze on colors in the traditional academic way or Renaissance way, but this is a new approach to painting that is much more straightforward. Instead of light and shadow, he gives you just a outline with sort of a blackish blue rather than a careful sort of chiaroscuro, which is not so much in his vocabulary. And this is a painting of the lady who owned that particular cafe we just looked at. You can see bright background. All the texture that you can see is the texture of just brush strokes, which becomes now a compositional element. You can see outlines in red for the hands, not so much a sense of light and shadow, but just making the hand and the face two different colors. And of course, textures and brushstrokes that make up the book and the back of the chair and all of that. So this is classic Van Gogh. using brushstroke, bold colors, very much copied from Japanese prints. And then, of course, Starry Night is one of the most well-known paintings in the world. Other painters might have painted the sky as clear or see-through. Van Gogh paints it with as much physicality as anything else in the painting. Cypress trees, town below, and the night sky. And there seem to be vibrations coming off the moon, off of the stars. The wind itself takes on a physical presence with all of these tiny, tiny brushstrokes laid together. So he is more expressive in his use of brushstroke, emphasizing the surface of the painting itself. The illusion that this is something other than a painting is entirely gone. This is just brushstrokes on a flat canvas, creating something absolutely new. If you go to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, if the guards didn't catch you, you could run your hands along the surface of the paintings and feel the texture that is there. Sometimes it's almost like he just squeezed it out of the tube and left it. This is, of course, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York today. And hundreds of other people saw the night sky, same time as Van Gogh did. He's the only person who saw it like this. He actually paints this painting when he is institutionalized, so he could not see the bottom half. He made that up or painted from memory. The top half is what he was looking out outside of his window. It is well known that Van Gogh cut off his ear. He seemed to have had some mental illness, and he died from a gunshot wound, presumed a suicide, after a kind of dark depression. That is somewhat borne out in his paintings. There's some recent research that suggests his death may have been accidental and not an intentional suicide. We don't know. But there is a great deal of emotional content in the paintings of Vincent van Gogh that people today seem to latch onto. During his lifetime, he was an absolute failure as an artist, so everyone thought. Only sold one painting, even though his brother was a gallery owner and art dealer. But today, one of the household names in the field of art. And then his friend Paul Gauguin. So Gauguin was a sometimes friend of Van Gogh, a frenemy. They painted together for a period of months in the Brittany region of France. Gauguin was much more successful as a salesman for his own work, and also, as a result of that, successful in selling paintings to some degree. He was formerly a stockbroker in Paris. He leaves behind his wife and 5 children. He moves to Panama and Tahiti eventually to paint the people there. So, not a great role model, but that is Paul Gauguin. This is a self portrait by Gauguin, and he sticks to fairly traditional, loose Cezanne style light and shadow for the faces of his people. But the background is absolutely flat, bright color, flat, bright pattern of wallpaper. This is a portrait of Gauguin painted by Vincent van Gogh on the wall. Of course, the entire painting is by Gauguin, but this painting here is by Van Gogh, and this is Gauguin's version with that included. So there are two Gauguins here, and the flat, bright colors here also come from Japanese prints. They are a great influence on a lot of painters from this generation, but Gauguin sticks more than Van Gogh does to the traditional light and shadow and loose chiaroscuro from Western painting. This is Gauguin's Night Cafe in Arles. And notice the red walls, notice the green pool table, notice this lady. And here she is again by Van Gogh. They painted together, they painted a lot of the same scenes. We don't know that these were painted at the same time, but they are of the same person. So you can get kind of a look at the style of Vincent van Gogh and the style of Paul Gauguin, and they've got some similarities. There is an emphasis on flat color, bold outline. There are more greenish and red complementary tones here in the Gauguin. And because this is a little more traditional, or maybe just because he is a better salesman for his own work, and kind of a larger than life extrovert, whereas Van Gogh is an introvert, Gauguin is largely successful in selling his paintings during his lifetime. So, this is one more painting painted during the time that he worked with Vincent van Gogh in the Brittany region of France. Vision After the Sermon. So this is a painting with a bright red background. Ordinarily, red is placed so that it comes to the front. This cannot come to the front because it's pinned back by this slice of brown that cuts through diagonally. The brown is a tree limb, has branches here, and the canopy of the tree, the leaves. It also kind of reads like a river, or maybe just like a big brown diagonal, because the painting is mostly flat. So this red that wants to come forward is pinned down by the brown. These ladies are nuns. This is a convent, and they are wearing stark black and stark white, gathered around in prayer, and they are seeing through their prayer a vision of Jacob wrestling with the angel. So that is here. Notice the pattern of these guys' feet is kind of echoed by the angles of this ox that is here. And Gauguin is sort of implying that visions often have kind of a terrestrial or earthly sort of impulse or something that sparks them. So it is a painting about religion. He is delving into the history of religious painting and the history of religion itself and its role in society. And in that aspect, he is fairly traditional as a painter, but the way that he paints it is absolutely his own thing. So this becomes very abstract. You have a field of red, a diagonal stripe of brown, a curving row of black and white, and then these two figures that are here. So that is Jacob wrestling with the angel, the vision after the sermon, which is based to some degree on real life. And then also from that time period, the Yellow Christ. You have the same nuns here. This picture was for me startling when I first saw it because Jesus looks like he is an extra from The Simpsons. He is bright yellow, he is cartoonish, his face is nothing but a line drawing. This is borrowing extensively from Japanese prints, and since I'm talking about them, let me just pull up Japanese prints here. And you can see that these prints from Japan, just on a generic Google search, have a lot of color. They have bold outlines. This sort of visual language is what is being borrowed from by both Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin. So the color goes in particular spots. There is line work that is done typically with a dark ink. Same sort of thing is happening here. So he is his own painter, but he's greatly influenced by the Prince of Japan and, of course, by real life as well. This painting is not so startling when you realize that in this region, the local church had a crucifix, large, made out of pine, which was fairly yellow and had yellowed over time. So the emaciated, yellowed figure of Christ is not just from his imagination, but is actually based in real life. And they are praying in the fields, and this manifests before them as if it is a vision. And then he moves to Panama, then Tahiti, a couple of other places, Martinique, and he paints the native people who are there. He comes up with his own style of painting that's very influential for a generation of later artists. And for the people, he tends to keep fairly standard chiaroscuro, although you can see there's a greenish tint to a lot of the figure here. This is a religious painting. This is Madonna and Child, but an island Madonna and Child with halos around both of these figures. There is an emphasis on bright colored flat pattern that is on the dress here and here, and also to some degree in the background. Bold, flat, bright color. when we look at Paul Gauguin's life today, we understand that this is not the way life was when he arrived there. Uh, the islands he visited were French colonies. They had been westernized. The church was a dominant feature on the island, and the women no longer wore just little skirts and went around topless as they had done maybe 100 years before. That's what he was hoping to find when he got there. When he did get there, he found that women wore long dresses that went all the way up to the neck, buttoned up entirely. There was a very much of an emphasis on Christianity and Catholicism within the islands, and a degree of punishment for native people who did not kind of toe that line. So what he is painting is very much a fantasy, right? He is a European male. He has this fantasy of scantily clad island women and this idyllic lifestyle in which you eat fresh fruit and catch fresh fish all day and lay around wearing very little clothing. And that was not the reality. It's sort of the reality he created for himself when he was there. And he had backers in Europe that he convinced, here's what it's like. Let me paint pictures of this and give me money to do so. So he kind of sells a bill of goods, including a book that he writes about his travels that is largely fiction. But the painting style that he brings into being, largely through his fantasy of this place that he is living, becomes very, very influential for later artists. So what he paints is not real life, but is greatly influential. And of course, that is a mix of religious subject matter with island subject matter. And he has a theory called synthetism, which is the synthetic production of images based on imagination and emotion. So ultimately, that is what you are seeing. He exaggerates, he puts in emotional color. This is one of his major paintings. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And you have island gods statues here. You have old age and new life. There is landscape. There is kind of self-investigation. It's almost like a Garden of Eden, but it's entirely based on his own internal life more so than the life that he actually observes and lives while he is there. But this is a new approach to painting, that painting can be synthetic. It can be based on imagination and emotion. And that is kind of the legacy of Paul Gauguin with his use of color, with his departure from reality into a world of his own making. And he is also very influential on an entire generation of artists that follows.